Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back. Black.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here at the John Hope Franklin Center for International and Interdisciplinary Studies, and we're joined today by Professor Jasmine Nichole Cobb, who is Assistant Professor of Art History and Visual Studies and African and African American Studies at Duke University. How are you doing today, Jasmine?
I'm well, thank you.
Jasmine is the author of the new book, Picture Freedom, Remaking Black Visuality in the Early 19th Century. It's a fascinating book. On this one hand, thinking about how black folks are depicted in freedom, how they imagined freedom. You know, this is before daguerreotypes. You know, this is before photography. To some extent, we're really thinking about kind of almost an extant archive. Talk a little bit how you got to this project.
It felt very circuitous, you know, of course. The finished product is something I'm pleased with, but it feels very different from what I started out with. I started out curious about free black people in particular and what they were doing in the early 19th century and before the abolition of slavery. When I went to the archive to find records to study such folks, I found representations that were hostile, that were negative, that were really unflattering, and didn't match what I knew about the 19th century before the abolition of slavery, which was that free black people were organizing, they were educating one another, they were owning property, they were doing all of these things, but their visual representations were mostly caricatures. Things created by whites who circulated around free black communities and were unhappy with the sort of progress free black people were making. And so I had to square visual representations that were negative in nature, ridiculing things about black religion, black language, black education, and then the written records free black people made of themselves because they weren't visually depicting themselves before the daguerreotype. And so the finished product is sort of the conversation between those kinds of documents.
So, you know, pictures become this kind of site of contestation in ways that I think we think about in a contemporary moment around the production and circulation of black digital images and obviously film and television.
Right.
But really, this is the media landscape in which folks are contesting, you know, black freedom, black bodies, black humanity. And it's so important, right? There's an investment by whites, you know, to not have to even acknowledge that free black folks exist. And you talk about, you know, part of it was about creating a white gaze that almost is all-knowing and all-seeing, as if somehow the white gaze, by depicting these pictures, had a kind of insight on blackness, you know, that no one else had.
Absolutely, an insight on blackness that was to be maintained from the transition from slavery to abolition, right? So if we think of slavery as having a visual culture steeped in white surveillance, white knowing, the management of black bodies in part through visual culture, then the move to abolition is about maintaining that. And what I talk about around the white gaze is how does abolition and processes of emancipation allow whites to maintain that sort of power structure and visual culture, to maintain its own white gaze, and for whiteness to avoid the kind of surveillance that blackness had endured under the structure of slavery.
And of course, the biggest threat to that white gaze, in fact, is a black gaze.
Absolutely.
A black gaze that can actually look whiteness in the face, if you will. I mean, in some ways, you know, when you talk about this black gaze, it has to be denied and curtailed and controlled. You know, it's an early moment around this notion of reckless eyeballing, right?
Right, where it's illegal in the state of Virginia to look for a black person to look a white person in the eye. That becomes a reason to be arrested. And it's this way in which social interaction is a site of visual contestation, right? And dealing with that in a way where records can't really tell you that in the way that pictures, hostile interactions can, but going to records of the law, of personal accounts, and we see that social interaction was just as fraught in visual culture, as was the act of depicting itself.
And the caricatures also do the work of denying Black substantive capacity actually to gaze critically.
Absolutely, right? By showing everything that Black people do as sort of a result of being wild, unwieldy, unthinking, uncontrolled. Caricatures remake things like marriage and education and property owning, or preaching in the pulpit is just some sort of untamable instinct as opposed to cultivation.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Jasmine Nichole Cobb, who is Assistant Professor of Art History and Visual Culture and African and African American Studies here at Duke University. The author of the new book, Picture Freedom, Remaking Black Visuality in the 19th Century. One of the things that I found fascinating about the book, you talk about the ways that obviously there's a difficulty prior to the daguerreotypes of Black folks being able to depict themselves, but they find other arenas to articulate notions of Black respectability. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So work like Monica Miller's work on fashion was really helpful for thinking about how self-styling and self-representation was a way to speak to the exigency of emancipation for Black people. I also look at visual practices, artistic practices, painting, drawing, and what doesn't appear on the page for what it can tell us about how Black people thought about representing themselves. I had a hard time for a while dealing with the fact that free people, and Black women in particular, don't depict their bodies when so many other people do, whites in particular. And I had to get okay with reading the absences for what they tell us about being free and being visible in the slaving era.
Yeah, it's that weird kind of hyper-visible invisibility,
Absolutely.
which has become kind of a mainstay of thinking about the Black body
Absolutely.
in American visual culture.
Absolutely, sort of always there and not there at all, right? That you have to be willing to see those absences as meaningful in some kind of way, and I think they are, particularly when the Black body is in peril in the slaving era.
Yeah.
And
what about these parlor spaces? The staging of parlor spaces to articulate a certain kind of notion. And you know, the parlor is something that when we think about contemporary homes, right, we don't normally think about the parlor, right? The best place in the house, right? The best furniture, the place where you entertain folks. It is your calling card, right? It's a space in the house where you make a certain kind of public statement in a private realm. Talk about the significance of these parlor spaces for free Blacks.
Sure. So that was sort of an interesting term for me to think about their imaging practices, their organizing, and the things they do within a domestic space, right? Particularly in slavery, when we think of what popular and visual culture tells us that in slavery, all Black people had nothing, right? Yeah. And so to think of Black people as having home spaces fit for display, fit for socializing, fit for organizing, which is what they did, the parlor, and African American parlors in particular, became an important thing for me to take up. In the book, I situate their writing, their reading, their drawing in these parlors. Folks like Frederick Douglass was visiting elite Black homes in Philadelphia in the early 19th century, and the parlor was where folks entertained Douglass, among others. And then the parlor also serves as a metaphor for thinking about domesticity, right? What it means to be at home, to have a home, particularly for Black people in the slaving era when the nation was not to be their home.
You mentioned that Black freedom was a visual problem. And you know, it could take on so many realms, right? Because if you think about, you know, freedom being visualized in certain kinds of ways, that obviously serves for inspiration for unfree Blacks.
Sure.
It represents a kind of threat and challenge for whites. How much do you think that these early examples of American visual culture being a kind of site of contestation, how much of that do you think we continue to live with?
Yeah, that's
250 plus years later.
Sure, I think it's just as much of a problem now as it was then. And I think that's something that I sometimes get pushback about, but I think that, one, the examples move forward in time, right? The reception of President Barack Obama as president, as a national citizen, but also how much our visual culture is comfortable with inviting us to imagine slavery and to picture slavery, and how it becomes very difficult to think about what freedom looks like when we encounter it and when we have to imagine it, right? And so, yeah, I think it's persistent.
You know, I suspect, 20 years from now, when we look back on the Obama presidency, but beyond all the policy decisions, critical eyes will find these small little nuanced moments where he actually has articulated something very politically sophisticated. You find some of these moments, in the backdrop of some of his press conferences, right? But providing for readers a kind of visual literacy for what's going on behind him that we might not think is meaningful at all, but in fact, you argue is quite significant.
Sure, I talk about this wallpaper that is in the diplomatic reception room of the White House. It was installed there in 1961 by First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy at the time. And I think in that moment, and up until President Barack Obama, it might have seemed like a rather benign representation, right? It includes free Black people scattered throughout the US. It's a 19th century wallpaper, and before a Black president stands before it, it just seems like a sort of relic of 19th century painting. But when a Black president, Barack Obama, stands before this wallpaper now, the fact that caricature is embedded into the wallpaper and was the basis for imagining Black freedom, time is collapsed in a complicated way, right? A Black president who we have a problem accepting as free and African American, right, in this moment, against the backdrop of a caricatured representation of Black freedom as the symbol of US ingenuity and democracy. There's a tension there, yeah.
Do you find that as a country we're any more literate around visual culture? Right? I mean, we think about, our colleague Rick Powell, who, just has curated this wonderful exhibit of Archibald Motley, that's now at the Whitney Museum, as one idea of a kind of aspect of Black visual culture that is now very visible, right? An artist that folks might not have thought about seriously, even 5 years ago. We know what's happening in terms of the video realm, right? We're producing both in terms of film and video shorts, and there's a way in which Blackness is more visual now, right, and visible now than it's ever been. But I'm not quite sure that as a country, both in terms of Black subjects, but also other folks, that we have any more literacy around reading visual culture.
I would agree that I think a greater number or greater quantity of Black folks producing images and circulating them. But as we've seen in recent controversies, that the production and institutional practice of creating and circulating images still becomes a hindrance for Black cultural producers, right? So creating images and getting them out and circulating is more possible through there being more venues, but when one has to bump up against powers that be in traditional institutions. I won't name any recent names, but we see that there's still resistance and a belief that, whites can orchestrate or manage the dissemination of Black images in a way that Black people can't. And that's a 19th century notion as well.
You're watching Left of Black. We've been joined today by Professor Jasmine Nichole Cobb, who is Assistant Professor of Art History, Visual Culture, and African American Studies here at Duke University. You authored the new book, Picture Freedom, Remaking Black Visuality in the Early 19th Century, that is published by New York University Press. What's next for you, Jasmine?
A project on Black freedom and Black hair, late capitalism.
So freedom and hair. So talk a little bit about this project.
So I'm still interested in Black aesthetic practices and questions of Black autonomy. There's something up to me in the way in which 19th century freedom movements and 20th century freedom movements aren't often put together.
Right.
And the 21st century burgeoning freedom movement, I think, is an opportunity to rethink that.
Wow.
And so the next project is about thinking about the 20th and 21st century Black freedom movements and Black aesthetics and centering Black women. And I think hair becomes such a site of contestation, right? It's association with a certain kind of liberation and autonomy, nature and not being constructed in the 1960s. And then the reemergence of that in the 21st century with the so-called natural hair movement not necessarily being connected to the contemporary Black freedom movement, right? And so I'm interested in, does this current movement have an aesthetic practice? Can we think about an aesthetic practice yet for the 21st century freedom movement? And what are the legacies of the 1960s freedom movements that stay with us now?
Well, we're going to look forward to having you back on
Thank you.
when that project comes out.
I'll look forward to it.
Thanks for joining us today, Professor Cobb.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for watch, and every black